It's my great honor. Actually, let me give you a side story here, just to show you how we have excellent friends and very good neighbors here. While I was in Seoul and I was in the car driving with Dr. Hee-Bom Lee, he mentioned a very good friend of his. And he said, Ayman, you should invite her to KMI and to give a speech. So I called her around Christmas time, and she answered the phone. So it's my great privilege to introduce to you Mrs. Tami Overby, Senior Vice President of Asia, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and also the President of the U.S. Korea Business Council. Tami Overby is, as I mentioned, is the Senior Vice President for Asia and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She leads Washington's premier international policy team that is devoted to helping American companies compete and prosper in Asia's dynamic marketplace. Mrs. Overby is responsible for developing, promoting, and executing programs and policies relating to U.S. trade and investment in Asia. Let's give her a big round of applause, everybody.
I'm good.
This is yours, right?
I have no idea. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's it. Cool. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank President Knapp, but especially Dr. Terabishi, who did call me while I was in Florida on vacation for Christmas. And I took his call, even though I didn't know him or the number, because I had gotten a call before that from my dear friend, Dr. Hee-Bom. I lived in Korea for about a little over 21 years. And one of my dearest friends, and someone that I call Oppa, which means elder brother, is Dr. Lee. We worked together in a variety of areas when he was the Minister of Trade, Industry, and Energy. We worked together when he was the chairman of KITA. We also worked together when he was the Korea Employers Federation, and now in his current capacity as the chairman of the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics. So even though I just got back from Beijing and Hong Kong and then had a root canal yesterday, there's no way I wouldn't make this meeting for this man. So I'm delighted to be here. Excuse me. I am the Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I also carry the title President of the U.S. Korea Business Council. For those of you who don't know the U.S. Chamber, we are the largest business federation in the world. We represent the interests of about 3 million American companies. We also run a lot of bilateral business councils. On my team for Asia, we're responsible for the U.S. Korea Business Council, the U.S. Japan Business Council, the U.S. Pakistan Business Council, and again, I was in China working on the U.S. Hong Kong Business Council. And our focus is really to try to help level the playing field for American companies in Asia. As I mentioned, when I lived in Korea a long time, but during the time, and I just want to again compliment my good friend Chairman Lee, that was his presentation is the most comprehensive description of the Korean miracle that I've seen. And since I've been covering Korea for almost 30 years, I've seen a lot of them. But I would urge you all, anyone who's interested in the Korean miracle, get a copy of his slides. That's the most cohesive story of how Korea went from one of the poorest nations in the world to the relative top. And they did it, what he didn't say, because Koreans are humble at their heart, they did it in a single lifetime. They did it faster than anyone's ever done it. Because I represent all Asia, I'm also responsible for 27 AmChams, American Chambers of Commerce in Asia. The U.S. Chamber has about, I think we have 118 AmChams in our network right now, and I cover the 27 in Asia. And one of our colleagues from Bangladesh was so interested in the Korean story that I brought him to Korea so that we could look at why there's such a difference. In the early 60s, Bangladesh and South Korea were the same. They had the same GDP. And yet, today, at that point it was probably in the mid-90s, suddenly South Korea is at the top and Bangladesh is still at the bottom, one of the poorest nations in the world. But South Korea had suddenly, with no natural resources, a small geographic footprint, roughly the size of the state of Indiana, no natural resources except one, the people. But they had become a relative leader in shipbuilding, semiconductors, autos, electronics. We've not seen an economy do this except for South Korea. So it really is a remarkable story. And over the years, I personally watched, I moved to Korea in 1988, but I saw them go from a command-controlled, inward-looking economy to one of the most vibrant, competitive economies in the world. And to put it in perspective, today Korea is the world's 6th largest exporter. They're the 9th largest importer, and they have the G20's largest budget surplus. Oh, and by the way, they also have the highest credit rating of any country in East Asia. Korea also has a network of trade agreements that cover 75% of the global GDP. They're the only country in the world that has free trade agreements with the U.S., with China, and with the EU. So the Koreans are pretty smart. Yet, with success comes some challenges, and I'll mention a few of them in a few minutes. But given my role, I just wanted to share some thoughts with you about U.S. trade with Asia under the new administration. And in particular, the importance of trade agreements like the KORUS FTA, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. And as a representative of the U.S. Chamber, I want to stress that U.S. companies are absolutely committed to remaining in Asia. I mean, it doesn't take, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that the economic engine of the world right now is Asia Pacific. And I would also say that as president of the U.S. Korea Business Council, on the whole, we find the KORUS Free Trade Agreement as a success. It is an important complement to our bilateral defense treaty that our countries share. But we also just witnessed a leadership change here in America, and that may impact the way the U.S. engages with the Asia Pacific in general and with South Korea specifically. When asked by my Korean friends and Asian friends across the region about America's trade policy under the new President Trump, I'm going to steal a line from The Wizard of Oz. Toto, we are not in Kansas anymore. Given the campaign rhetoric of both candidates during the election and the views of some of the incoming cabinet appointees, I believe we are at a really important inflection point on trade here in America. And as we continue to have the debate about where trade is headed, I pray that we move beyond the campaign rhetoric. During the campaign, I believe that the discussion on trade in America by both candidates was a fact-free zone. What I mean by that is very simple. They were not talking about the real economic facts. I think we have to stop using trade as a scapegoat for broader concerns about stagnant wages, income inequality, and job losses in manufacturing. Don't get me wrong, these are real problems. Trade is not the reason for these problems. I would suggest that trade is and should be a bigger part of the solution. The U.S. needs to take a holistic view of trade. We must have fact-based conversations. We don't need alternate facts. We need real facts. Forgive me. And I know the press is here. Be kind. But I think we have to continue to educate the public, policymakers and politicians on the benefits and the stability that trade has brought to the U.S., to South Korea, and globally. Simply put, we've got to start telling the truth on trade. What is the truth? Well, the majority of Americans actually support trade and they recognize its benefits. This might come as a shock if you've been listening to some of the public discourse on the topic, but if you look at reputable surveys from Pew, from Gallup, and the Chicago Council on World Affairs, among others, and the facts agree with the American opinion. So let's explore the myth that American manufacturing has been killed by trade. First of all, fact. The U.S. manufacturing sector today is more productive than ever, debunking the myth that American manufacturing is on the decline. But employment in manufacturing is down sharply. While employment rebounded to just over 12 million manufacturing jobs last year, that's down 5 million jobs from 10 years ago. So what happened? Where'd those jobs go? Well, trade accounts for very little, approximately 15% of that job loss. What's responsible for the rest? Productivity, technology, innovation. New business models have disrupted traditional industries. Think about Amazon, Uber, Airbnb. It's a whole new world out there. The result is America is more productive than we've ever been, but we need far fewer employees to produce the same amount of goods. The only trend that's accelerating with the use, and this trend is only accelerating with the use of robots and artificial intelligence. Now, I understand this is no consolation to people who've lost their jobs. And I'm not suggesting that they should just accept it. But taking care of those adversely affected by technological innovations is a real social and economic challenge that requires an honest conversation. Ignoring the issue at hand and using trade as a scapegoat is only going to intensify the problem and leave the American economy at a serious competitive disadvantage. It's also important to note that trade is not just about manufacturing, nor is a trade deficit or surplus a good indicator to the health of an economy. President Trump has continuously pointed to trade deficits with certain countries, citing failed or job-killing trade agreements as the cause. And I have to say, he has had very good message discipline when he talks about the Chorus FTA, because it's always followed by that job-killing agreement. And I have to tell you, that is an inaccurate statement. It's not an alternative fact, it's an inaccurate statement. Look at wage costs in South Korea, compare them with the U.S., and you will see a relative equal amount. Companies are not closing their factories in America and moving them to Korea because it's a low-wage market. In fact, in some sectors, it's even more expensive in South Korea. So Chorus is not killing jobs in America. Now, NAFTA and trade with China have also been particular targets of criticism. Again, the facts tell a different story. The real cause of trade deficits is that Americans consume more than we save. Not that we have bad trade agreements. Indeed, U.S. trade agreements improve our trade relations and increase our exports. I would suggest we need more of them, not less. We run a trade surplus with our 20 FTA partners. And for those that we have a deficit, the International Trade Commission estimated our FTAs improve the trade balance. In other words, our deficits would have been much worse had we not had a trade agreement in force. And that's the case with the Chorus FTA. We do have a deficit with Korea that would have been billions of dollars worse if we didn't have the Chorus FTA in force. Now, the 21st century economy, it's more driven by services, information and communications technology, healthcare, pharmaceutical, medical devices, than it is by low-value manufacturing, which, by the way, is where most of the jobs in America have disappeared, in the low-value manufacturing. Now, America runs very large surpluses in services, as well as with agriculture. We have a competitive advantage, figures that are all too often overlooked for political reasons. So I'm here to talk about the Korea story, so I'll talk about Chorus, the full picture. These distinctions are particularly important when you look at the U.S.-Korea relationship. If the election is any indication, as we approach the 5-year anniversary of Chorus, March 15th, mark your calendars, one number sticks out to the new president and his team, and that's the $26 billion deficit for trade in goods between the U.S. and Korea. That's the single number that this new administration seems to be focused on. Yet it's our job to advocate on the U.S.-Korea relationship and remind people that in 2015, for example, the U.S. had over $11 billion surplus in services with South Korea. And also, by the way, our exports in defense equipment and LNG are not included in the goods, the deficit number, which seems to be the only number that folks are looking at. Korea is actually the largest purchaser of U.S. military equipment in the world, and that number is growing. In an effort to modernize the force and in part to meet the alliance's operational requirements, the South Korean government has initiated a $12 to $14 billion worth of U.S. foreign military sales, acquisitions programs over the last 3 years, an amount that exceeds their cumulative defense requirements for the last decade. So Korea is buying America, and they're buying a lot of it in the defense sector. And those numbers don't include direct commercial sales in the military area, which the Korean government has recently shown a preference for over the foreign military sales in an effort to get a lower price, and it's also simpler and faster. So we need to look at the whole macroeconomic picture because FTAs don't operate in a vacuum. Economies tend to import more goods when they're growing and less when they're slowing. The Korean economy growth has been slower in the past few years, but Chorus has been growing. The Korean economy grew at a pace of 6% in 2010, but in 2011 it fell to 3.7, and in 2015 2.6. And that slower growth affects Korea's domestic demand, which, guess what? They buy less from us when they're slowing. Conversely, the U.S. growth rates have been going up. They've been in the 1.5 range. They're going up to 2.5. U.S. domestic demand has picked up. And overall, when our economy's stronger, we import more. And the impact, for now, it's a widening deficit on the goods trade. And that seems to be what our incoming administration is focused on. Again, I want to encourage people to look at all the data. The data tells the story. Korea's imports from the world fell by 17% in 2015. But in comparison, the imports of U.S. goods fell by less than 3%. So the world took a big hit from Korea. We took a much smaller hit. And the reason is because we have a high standard free trade agreement in force. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and say that Chorus has not had any challenges. There have been a lot of them. Unfortunately, too many of them. But I would suggest that the mechanisms inside the agreement have allowed us to work effectively for our governments to resolve these issues. Most of those issues very quickly as they arise. In a large part, this is attributable to the willingness of officials on both sides to want to resolve these quickly and effectively. They dig in, they find solutions to these problems, and there are formal consultations built into the mechanisms built into the Chorus FTA, but there's also a dispute resolution mechanism. So if we don't get satisfaction from either side, we can go to formal dispute resolution, but we haven't had to use that because the mechanisms inside the agreement are working. Is it perfect? No. I'm not tall and thin. Life is not perfect. But I would say it's working. I'm working too. Again, without such a framework like the Chorus FTA, both U.S. and Korean companies would find themselves in limbo with a lot of issues piling up. Something that I see in the U.S.-China relationship, because we don't have an FTA with China. We don't even have a bilateral investment treaty with China. So those irritants continue to pile up. But in Korea, we have a manageable list of issues, and we're working them all the time. Bom is just one example of the outstanding, and An Ho-yun, Ambassador An, another terrific example of great partners in Korea that want to solve these issues, and we work very effectively to do so. The U.S. business community still believes that the Chorus Free Trade Agreement is a gold standard agreement. It is the highest standard free trade agreement America has in force today. And that's really important in a part of the world where the rules are not always clear. In Asia, it's a challenging place to do business, especially now that we have officially withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Chorus FTA is going to be even more important. And some people ask me, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I mean, if I'm an American company and I'm looking for a place to invest in Asia, I'm going to encourage them to go to Korea first, because you're going to have higher predictability. You're going to have higher standards, rule of law. You have an incredibly educated workforce, and you have a free trade agreement that works. So that predictability, that's where I would start. Also, I think with the Chorus FTA, it's been in force 5 years. I think we're going to have to continue to build on that. Since TPP is dead for now, or maybe dead forever, we're going to have to use the tools we have. So Chorus, it's the gold standard of free trade agreements. How can we find ways? There's a clause in Chorus that says both countries shall endeavor to refrain from imposing or maintaining unnecessary barriers to electronic information flows across borders. The Chorus FTA is the first free trade agreement that has cross-border data flow in it. So TPP would have, but that's out. So Korea has it in it. So that means data can flow very easily from inside Korea to anywhere else. And there's also forced localization. That's where countries say, yeah, the data can flow, that's okay, we get that, but we want you to maintain the data in our country. Well, Korea doesn't do that. Chorus has helped us set up standards so that our companies are able to choose where economically they want to keep that data. Think about it, if all countries say, okay, data can flow, but we want you to maintain the data there, you lose the economies of scale, and suddenly you lose the power of the internet. Because if one country does it, others are going to do it. So in Chorus, we've been able to work that out. And there were bumps, certainly in the first couple of years, but we're at a place now, our companies tell us those provisions are working. So we need to continue to build on cross-border data flow, and we need to work together with Korea to ensure that our companies on both sides are able to benefit. Such a move would show leadership. Korea already has shown tremendous leadership in Asia. Again, they have more FTAs, and they're the only country that has free trade agreements with the U.S., China, and Europe, the EU. Progress in other areas, I want to bring up a little bit about some of the granular problems. But at a time when trade is under attack, populism and protectionism is growing, we have to remind people that trade is about creating jobs and growing your economy. And that helps increase the standard of living for both sides. Korea is a great example. But also we need to remember that not all challenges can be resolved through trade, that some structural challenges within an economy still need to be addressed. And Dr. Lee, he mentioned several. Korea's biggest challenge, they've got to maintain their competitiveness. They need to increase their productivity in order to ensure future prosperity. And despite how fast and how effectively Korea has moved up the global economic ladder, they do still have a number of structural problems that hold Korea back. They are still heavily dependent on manufacturing. They have low service sector productivity. They're still heavily dependent on exports. And I think the biggest challenge of facing Korea is their demographics, their rapidly aging workforce. And Korea's economy is still geared heavily to the manufacturing of steel, ships, autos, chemicals, and electronics. While boasting some of the most globally competitive companies in each of these sectors, Korea is increasingly under competitive pressure from China. China is moving up that value chain, and they're moving up fast. They're also under pressure from other low-cost competitors due to Korea now has become a high-wage market. Korea has strong unions. Their unions have an outsized voice based on compared to the number of percentage of unionization. And again, they have an aging workforce. Also, considering the manufacturing increasingly relies on capital inputs rather than labor, this should really be front and center with Korea's policymakers. The counterpoint to Korea's manufacturing strength is the relative competitive weakness and low productivities of the service sector, particularly finance and insurance. According to the most recent statistics, service sector productivity stands at just 40%. And the productivity level relative to manufacturing, and Korea ranks lowest among the 26 OECD companies in a 2015 study. So Korea is also still heavily dependent on exports, and thus it's vulnerable to global markets. When there's a global slowdown, when the global markets sneeze, Korea gets pneumonia. Now there has been some diversification, but Korea's dependency on exports is significantly higher than the global average. But the biggest challenge, as I said, is demographics. By the way, Korea is not an economy that welcomes immigration. And that's a challenge that I know they're trying to deal with. It is the fastest aging country in the world, and it will become a post-age society where 20% of the population is 65 or older by 2026. And that's just 26 years after being considered an aging society. So they're aging at a much faster rate. For comparison, among OECD countries, it took Japan 36 years to make that transition, Germany 76 years, and the U.S. 88 years. And Korea unfortunately reached that number in 26 years. The trends are accelerated by, they also have the OECD's lowest birth rate, which was 1.24%, or 1.24 in 2015, well below the 2.1 rate needed to maintain your current population. Yeah, I'm not going to speak to that. The women they're marrying later or not marrying and choosing not to have children. Let's quickly take a look at the numbers. Okay, and I don't know how to use this. The next one.
All right, let's just.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So the As you can see, Korea's working age population and core population, those aged 25 to 49, are on the downward trajectory. What does it mean? It means lower productivity, slower GDP growth, and less investment across the economy. Korea is going to experience falling demand. As people age, they save more and buy less. The won is likely to rise due to rising higher real estate rates, which doesn't bode well for Korea's export dependency. And any intervention to stop that rate is politically risky. Further, an increase in older Koreans will create fiscal strain on government Social Security programs that fund retirement and health benefits. And the low birth rate is going to result in smaller workforce with a greater burden of financing such programs. Businesses are going to have to deal with a shortage of entry-level workers and young consumers. And the military, it'll have an impact on the young population. They'll have fewer people to ensure the security of the South Korean peninsula. Fortunately, there are solutions to these challenging problems, many of which involve the private sector. For example, the private sector can help alleviate some of the financial burden on the government programs through supplemental retirement programs that allow for allocation of excess savings. The U.S.-Korea Business Council has published a report recently outlining some of these solutions, and we're happy to share it if anybody has an interest. Other solutions include raising productivity, fully including women in the workforce, and delegating more authority to the young while raising the retirement age. And also, I would suggest looking at immigration. Let's start briefly with increasing productivity and effectively using the workforce. Innovation in IT, artificial intelligence, and Internet of Things can continue to increase worker productivities for all ages, and continued investment in these areas should remain a priority. On the healthcare side, there are many goods and services available to keep individuals healthy and productive longer. Innovative therapies enable patients to continue contributing to society, even after they've been diagnosed with illnesses. But in order to do that, those products, those pharmaceuticals and medical devices have to be available. And one of the areas we see challenges in the Chorus FTA is getting a fair and reasonable reimbursement for pharmaceuticals and medical devices. As it stands now, Korean patients are lacking access to medicines and other, compared to other developed countries. For example, as you can see, Korea reimburses fewer medicines, and they take a longer time to reimburse. Making those innovative therapies available would be a substantial benefit to the society across the board. With regard to increasing women's participation in the workforce, a lot can be done. Women are more economically active than men in their 20s, mostly because the men are in the military, but there is a drastic change over time. By age 29, men and women have roughly equal labor force participation rates, just above 60%. But as men age, their labor force participation rate tends to climb to around 90%, whereas women tend to stagnate. That's partly a problem because in Korea, when women get married, there's an expectation that when they have children, they will stay at home to take care of the children. Public child care is something that the government is working very hard on. But it's also going to require more than just the government. It's going to require a mindset change. Someone's going to have to convince that mother-in-law that her daughter-in-law is still a good daughter-in-law if she's working. But right now, if grandma is not taking care of the children, in this case it's usually just one, she's viewed as a bad mother. I say that because my sister, who is living in Seoul for, she's almost 20 years there now. She's married to a Korean Canadian. They have 2 children. She's a good mother. She stays at home and takes care of them. But she's not contributing. and it annoys the heck out of me because I paid for her master's, and she's not getting the economic value that she should be. But her mother-in-law is happy, and in Korea, that's really important. These trends force Korea to the bottom of major OECD nations in terms of labor force participation. Okay, that's all the slideshow. What contributes to this disparity? It's a combination of access to childcare, social responsibilities and pressures, both at home and in the workplace, and an increase of males entering the workforce following military service, all challenges in their own rights. And it is going to require a holistic approach if Korea wishes to remain globally competitive going forward. And last but not least, there's a serious need to address youth unemployment. Korea's workforce is among the best educated in the world. However, when you talk to young Korean graduates, and this is, I believe it's a societal problem, their parents want them to work one of two places. They want them to work in a chaebol, a major conglomerate, or they want them to work for the government. There's not a real appreciation of entrepreneurial spirit, SMEs. There really isn't that, and again, it's a society thing. So a young man or a young woman who graduates from university and they want to start their own company, that's not looked on favorably. Also, one other point I would add about South Korea is if a company fails, it is viewed as shame. Whereas many of our investment bankers, they won't invest in a company if the CEO hasn't failed a couple of times. And the reason is they don't want to pay for him to learn. They want him to, somebody else's dollar to have paid for that. But in South Korea, it's still, it's really hard to have a career failure and come back from that. And I think that's one of the strengths of America is, you can fail a lot and still pull yourself up by the bootstraps and become a success. But that mindset, that concept, it's not well embraced in Korea. And again, they're very much, they want their kids to work at either a chaebol or for the government. And again, Korea is changing. It's very dynamic. In Korea, they say Bali Bali. But in order to change, to get to that Bali Bali, you need national consensus. I was privileged to live in Korea in 1997 and 98 when they had a financial crisis. And 1 year, the economy shrank 10.6%. The next year, it grew double digits. And I couldn't understand how that was possible until I saw South Koreans lining up at their banks, taking their gold and their diamonds off and donating it to their country. We had a global financial crisis here in 2008 and 9. There's no way I'm taking my little Cartier gold. America, that's your problem. But in Korea, it was their problem. They are urinar. We are all one. And that strength, that's something that I would never invest against Korea. And I say that very selfishly because while I was in Korea, I invested in Korea. When I came back to the United States and sold my Samsung and Hyundai stock, it has allowed me to live a lifestyle that I never could have dreamed of. So to all my Korean friends in the audience, go home, work hard, and continue to make sure my retirement is as comfortable as it should be. I want to thank you all for your attention. This was very
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Tami, one question, right?
Sure,
and
please.
I think I want to ask this question on behalf of all Korean companies.
Yes.
They're apprehensive. They're concerned.
Sure.
And they don't know what's happening, right? They get the news from different sources, and we don't know if it's even real news or fake news or intergalactic news. It's news. What would you tell Korean companies in Korea looking to continue the work they're doing with the U.S. or thinking about coming to the U.S. to work, or what's going to happen next? There's a lot of unknown here. So I have you on stage here. So
Sure.
What would you say to them as kind of thinking forward, next 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years from now?
Well, frankly, I think Korean companies are very well positioned. They have quality FTAs with the U.S., with China, and with the EU. So South Korean companies are well positioned to take advantage of the chaos and turmoil that is beginning. I say that because my last 6 years has been focused on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where the U.S. basically bullied and nagged and pushed other countries to agree to a very high set of comprehensive, high standards, and I went to a lot of negotiating rounds, made a lot of friends among the other 11 countries, and some of the other negotiators estimate approximately 90% of the final text was U.S. supported. So we got what we wanted, these high standards. We got countries like Vietnam and Malaysia to agree to very high standards in intellectual property rights, new standards on state-owned enterprises, cross-border data flow. There are rules in TPP that aren't in any existing agreement. And the U.S., again, we were the drafter, the author of most of them. We got what we wanted. But sadly, America cannot take yes for an answer because politically, it's not popular to focus on facts. And the facts are TPP, an agreement with 12 countries, approximately 40% of global GDP, would have driven Asia to a high standard. And oh, by the way, we have a saying in trade, if you are not moving forward, you're falling behind. So while we have our little political discourse here, China is and India are pushing something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. TPP was up here as comprehensive high standards. Think RCEP is down here. It doesn't include strong IP protections. It doesn't have rules on state-owned enterprises. It does not level the playing field for American companies. And get one other thing. America is not part of RCEP. Regional free trade agreements, they are preferential agreements. They benefit the countries that are in them. If you're outside them, you don't benefit. South Korea is part of RCEP. So I think South Korea is well positioned. Again, with my hat of the U.S.-Korea Business Council, any American company who's looking to do business in Asia, I'm pushing them to South Korea. When TPP was alive, I was pushing them to Vietnam because Vietnam, low wage, but high standards, comprehensive rules, predictable, and the final TPP text, it's better than Chorus. Chorus is gold standard. TPP had more new things in it. So I'm not worried about Korean companies, frankly. I'm worried about how American companies are going to compete. And I'm hoping that our government will very quickly, pivot. Okay, pivot's probably not a good word because it was used by the last administration, but refocus or negotiate some new deals, but recognize that we need to do it in a regional way because you get more benefits when you're all together. The U.S. market's already open, so there's not a lot we can give countries when we're negotiating, but other countries can give. And we were successful in TPP in getting these very high standards, and we didn't have to pay for it. Other countries were paying for it. I'm sorry, that was more than you asked, but you can see I'm still adjusting. Thank you.